I think everything in that Welcome to Canberra poster should be happening, and a lot of other people feel the same way. And that's how KSCA basically got started. So the minute I mentioned to Alex, it went viral, and since then everybody has jumped on board. We've got some fantastic people involved, and I'm just so glad that it actually had the legs to take off and become what it's become today. So without further ado, I'll introduce Klara.
Yeah, so I have been working with hemp since 1999. I'm president of what's something called the Australian Industrial Hemp Alliance. So I started farming hemp in 1999 in Wollombi. The reason I started farming hemp was because I was working with Greening Australia at the times, and the thing that was really disconcerting for me was watching the specialists who knew about medicinal frogs, the specialists who knew about birds, about all sorts of plants, didn't get the opportunity to bring their information to the table, and the conservationists who were there had gone into it so idealistically, because we said, okay, we're not going for a radical position, we'll go for somewhere which is middle ground. There does need to be some logging, it needs to be, forests need to be managed. You actually end up with a whole lot of problems that we heard about this morning from some of the Indigenous speakers. You know, Aboriginal people are really very well aware that land does need to be managed. But it's not the way that it is currently managed or by forestry. And so really what happened for me is, once they'd really moved the goalposts, which was that we weren't talking about logging between this amount and this amount, we were talking about logging this much or this much, all of which was essentially massive logging, I realised that we needed to find other organic materials that people could build houses with and that people could use for manufacturing other materials. At the time, the New South Wales government said that hemp wasn't viable in Australia, and they had done these trials on rocky ground with no irrigation, on clay with no irrigation. I now look back on that and think that's really good knowledge to have, because what we know is that it doesn't naturalise too easily, so it's not going to take over. It actually does need to have a really good soil, seed bed for the soil to get established. So in 1999 we established that you could grow hemp, and in 2000 I started working at New South Wales Uni with my brother, who was the founding director of the Australian Centre for Construction Innovation. And he had incredible expertise, and still does, in lean construction and concrete. And so obviously it took us probably 8 years to come to a point where we had a meeting of the minds, because I was talking about everything but concrete, and talking about renewable resources, and he couldn't really understand where I was coming from. The purpose of the research was to look at European research in hemp building, and then to see if we could lower the carbon footprint of that, and what in fact was the way that you could make the lowest embodied energy hemp building material that had the strength that you could use it in mainstream construction. So the materials went through a series of tests at New South Wales Uni. Probably, yeah, just to talk a little bit about farming hemp, and you will have to guide the conversation a bit, because I can talk about farming hemp, about what it does for land, what it does in crop rotations, those kinds of things, or I can talk more about the industrial applications. And I'll just say that up here is a display which is about the industrial applications, and you'll see a photo there of the Lotus and the Kestrel. So one's a British car, the other is a Canadian car. All of the external panels are made out of hemp biocomposite, as are all of the internal moulded parts, as are the textiles. So full hemp car, two of them. There is also Earth Race, which was New Zealand's, I think it was Greenpeace's boat that actually got rammed by the Japanese whaling ships with Earth Race. Earth Race had a hemp hull, so that should give people an indication that there's an opportunity for that to go into maritime industries. So if we talk about what does South Australia need, it's just losing its car industry, it's losing a whole lot of other, manufacturing industry. Perhaps that's an ideal thing for South Australia to be looking at, and that's certainly being presented to the South Australian government at the end of this month. So the Greens are putting forward a bill for legislation change there in South Australia. So we've got biocomp. There's also a scooter there that's just been, produced, so that's made out of hemp and canaf and glue. There are hemp sunglasses. So really anything, virtually any manufactured product that has fiberglass in it, that has any sort of material wadding. If I was in the UK and I had a child with allergies, I'd be buying a Peacock brand mattress, because that's full hemp stuffing. The value of hemp antifungal, antibacterial, doesn't grow mold. So they're the values again in a house. So if I'm building with hemp building material and I'm building with something that doesn't allow molds to grow in the building. So in Australia, we've got a huge amount of asthma, we've got a huge amount of eczema, and they're actually associated with molds in buildings. And we get molds in buildings because we build with concrete or we build with conventional masonry plus concrete, and so you get molds growing in the insides of buildings. There's a fair bit of talk now about indoor air quality, and there'll be lots more because the UN is trying to actually regulate about plastics and things like that. I don't know whether any of you saw a program that I saw on the ABC a few years ago, and what they did was they lit up 2 bedrooms in a house. One of them had modern furnishings in it, and the other one had furnishings made from natural materials. And what they were measuring was how many minutes you had to get your kids out of the bedroom. So in a room that has natural materials in it, you've got 17 minutes to get your kids out of the bedroom. And in a building that has got modern materials in it, you've got 3 minutes to get your kids out of the bedroom because the bed is actually made out of petrol, or a version of petrol. If you've got foam furnishings in your house, that's petrochemical, and that will all ignite at an incredible rate. So yeah, anything that has got a fiberglass, anything that is a textile, you'll see up there. There is wadding, there is strapping. Obviously, everyone knows the old history of hemp, which is that any ropes, any strings, any textiles. At the moment, we're not really in a good position to grow or to manufacture textiles in Australia because we sold off nearly all of our manufacturing equipment. I think we still have the outside of the buildings in southern New South Wales, but we sold off all our textile manufacturing equipment to China. So China is producing all of the world's hemp textiles, and we're now buying it back from there, as is the rest of the world, and you kind of got to go, well, we gave it away. The Ashford project's a really nice project because they're very poor farmers. So there was no money for fertiliser, there was no money for anything. It's a tobacco growing land that we're trying to rehabilitate out there. It has residues of DDT, all of those sorts of things. So the research we applied to it are that we know from the Belgian Nuclear Research Institute that hemp will clean up radiated soils, and you can still use the hemp, the fibre that is in the central part of the plant. You can't use the root ball or the seed head. We know from Polish research that hemp will clean up heavy metals, and we know that it will clean up surplus nutrients. So it's actually a really good bioremediator or phytoremediator for a farm. Out there really literally wasn't money for fertiliser, so they had some pigs which were run in on that area, and we grew a 5-metre high crop of hemp. We were right next to the river, but we actually minimal irrigated, even though, so that's how we came to that figure of we can use, because they're also lucerne farmers, that we can grow hemp with a third of the amount of water used for lucerne. So when it comes to buildings, I'll just mention this briefly. The big advantage of building with hemp is the capacity to lock up carbon and harvest carbon. So if I just talk about the carbon profile for a minute, on 1 hectare I can lock up a tonne of soil carbon. I can harvest off 15 tonnes of above ground carbon. When that's calculated in greenhouse gas emissions, it's actually 1.7 kilo of carbon equivalent kilos for every kilo that I harvest off. So what they're measuring is how much warming are we avoiding. So in a building, in a small building, in a small cabin, I can lock up 2 or 3 tonnes of carbon for a very long time. So what we know from Japanese buildings is up to 300 years. In a reasonable sized family home, I can be locking up 5 or 6 tonnes of carbon. And in a commercial build, like they've got happening in the UK, I can lock up 500 tonnes of carbon in a commercial building. So it has phenomenal application if you're talking about managing greenhouse gases and managing carbon. Both, and I'm talking about greenhouse gases more generally because nitrous oxide emissions, which are the third highest, so we've got carbon, we've got methane, and we've got nitrous oxide. Carbon is what we've got most of. Methane and nitrous oxide are the ones with the greater warming potential. Nitrous oxide emissions mainly come from conventional agricultural fertiliser use. So if you can change over to any other kind of, so minimal fertiliser use, or if you can change over to growing with sustainable farming regimes, and hemp can grow organically. So even let's not go as far as organic, we just say we grow farming sustainably, then there is a huge opportunity for carbon uptake and for that to be locked into any kind of infrastructure that you can imagine. Because it's used for thoroughbred racehorse bedding because it absorbs something like 13 times its own weight in moisture, so you only have to muck out stables every 4 or 5 days rather than every day. It's used in reptile park bedding, it's used in kitty litter, all of these sorts of things. So what we were looking at is what machinery could be adapted, tea tree harvesting, so a forage harvester can be brought in and that can be used instead, and green harvest, but then you need access to a loosen dryer.
Can I just add a point there?
Yep.
A local grower at Mackay has actually done a fair bit of work with hemp, a fellow by the name of Joe Muscat. And in the sugarcane industry, obviously, we have sugarcane harvesters. So the sugarcane harvester actually, as it turns out, is a very good hemp harvester.
Yep.
And that was part of the idea, was to harvest the hemp and use it as a fuel source for powering the mill at the beginning of the season. So the mills are run by sugarcane to gas, which is the byproduct of the milling process. It's the fibre after the sugar juice is extracted. But in the beginning of the season, obviously, they don't have any of that, and until they get going, they burn coal. So as a way to remediate that, there was the idea of planting some hemp on the fallow ground and burning hemp in the initial phase. So yeah, sugarcane harvesting equipment harvests hemp very successfully.
How is it bonded? What do you use?
There are multiple different ways of bonding it. I'm not sure what you were looking at. The CD cover has got an element of recycled plastic in it, a small amount of recycled plastic in it. Then the sunglasses that you see up there, that's actually a bioresin that has been used in that. So bioresins are much more recent. This is actually a very old thing, and as is that CD case is a very old thing. So, for example, if you were living somewhere where there was macadamia hull, you would be looking at macadamia hull resin because that's a phenomenal resin. There are multiple, there's a fantastic website called asknature.org or the Biomimicry Institute, and it's based in America, but really what it's doing is sending people constantly, if you're innovating, it sends you back there constantly to look for how does nature do this and how could we mimic that process. So we now see water collectors that, for example, mimic the action of the way that water runs off a lotus leaf, and that's because it's particularly good. Or they will actually, and speaking of, in Australia, one of the things they're looking at is the thorny devil. Yeah, so the little lizard that is up in the territory, about how that gathers water. So it's really just encouraging people to, instead of looking at what were conventional industrial solutions to things, go back into nature and have a look. What is it that makes a gecko stick to the ceiling? What are all of those natural adhesives, either natural adhesives or actual structures that we can be using instead of using really toxic things?
One of the things that we're concerned about as KSCA is the fact that we are ignoring the potential benefits of weeds. Okay, so you've heard Diego or participated in Diego's weedy walks, and we've got artists as family here who do the same thing with foraging. Both hemp and bamboo are classified as weeds, and the phenomenal resource that is being ignored, it just can't go on. You've seen an example of hemp and bamboo in the windows of the Camus projects. That was bought as a kit. The bamboo bike frame was bought as a kit, and it's actually held together using hemp, twine, and an eco-epoxy. So the eco-epoxy is created from the waste stream of biodiesel and cooking oil, and they've only recently rejigged the formulation so it produces a clear eco-epoxy. And it's exactly the same as a mineral eco-epoxy, but it doesn't have any of those detrimental off-gassing effects when you're actually using it. So you don't have to wear a face mask, just working in an open area is safe enough.
Big learning curve for me was that the first investors who approached my son and myself were the uranium and the coal industry, and I was horrified. Maybe. And then I came away going, I actually have to learn to communicate with those people, because if I think that they're all going to put their money away and let all of the greenies that I know run the economy, then I really need to wake up to myself. I have to work out how to work with those people.
Where are you at in that process?
We didn't take on any investment.
Can I just make a further comment on that? I mean, they aren't going to shut you down. And I mean, one of the things that in a sense led up to the poster and everything was a lot of work I did in Lithgow with Lithgow Council around economic development. And that included doing a lot of work with the coal mining companies. And what I discovered from actually talking to those coal mining executives was and to the energy, to the power stations, was the sheer amount of money and research that they were putting into trying to shore up their future. Partly they were just going to hang on with what they were doing as long as they could, what basically was made illegal. But in the meantime, they were pouring enormous amounts of money and effort into other forms of energy and other forms of activity. They were really looking at hot rocks. They were looking at wind because they had the power network there, But there was a great incentive to build another source of energy there. So I mean, they don't shut things down. They actually realise they have to survive. They're focused on their own survival, and that if they have to change to survive, they'll change to survive. That's what adaptation's all about. And that's why we talk about adaptation so much.
I think that everybody needs to change in all directions, including people like myself, who need to not quite, kind of freak out and go, this is actually somebody who's made their money out of uranium and coal, and that they're going to buy us out and run us out of town, and work out how it is that we can actually engage with those people, because if you don't engage, then you are going to be run out of town.